Thank you, Lou, for that very nice introduction. I'd also like to thank you and Travis for all the work that you've been putting together to get these two sessions up and running. It's something that NACIS needs, and I'm glad to see it coming to fruition. So as you were giving the introduction, as you were giving in the introduction, my CoStar app went off. Now I don't put much stock in astrology, but the quote of the day for me is show appreciation to your loved ones, and I feel very loved by this crowd. I see lots of people that I love and I think love me back. I don't know. We'll see after this talk. So. With all of that said, I'll get started on my talk. So I'd like to start this presentation by asking a series of questions. What exactly is queer cartography? What does it mean to queer cartography? And why does it matter to you? The simple fact is that even in a session focused on queerness, it's likely that many of the individuals in this room are not queer themselves. The point of observing this is not to reinforce binaries between straight and queer, but rather to offer up a question. What does queer cartography provide to cartography as a whole? This talk outlines what queer cartography can be, what it allows us to do as cartographers, and why it's relevant to all who study and create maps. Also, you can hear me perfectly fine? Okay, just making sure. So for those of you who have been coming to NACIS conferences for several years, you may be familiar with some of the projects shown here on the screen, one of which was done by our very own next speaker, Jack Eastking. Over the past decade, the rise in digital cartography in the spatial humanities has enabled the development of numerous projects focusing on queer life around the world. And these maps are important representations of queer life. And while there's much to be explored about how decisions were made in these maps about modes of representation, data sources, and the like, over the past several years, I've felt myself becoming a little bit more tired of these sorts of maps. Not because of any particular issues with the maps themselves, but because rather these maps don't necessarily advance new forms of thinking about cartography itself. And so I find myself surprisingly agreeing with Mark Daniel, who argued that many of the maps heralded as radical cartography in the early 2010s were not really radical cartography products, but maps made by radical individuals or maps showing radical topics. So in a similar vein, the queer mapping projects you saw on the previous slide are queer because the data that they highlight is queer, of queerness, and oftentimes the positionality of the cartographer was also queer. But all the elements that actually comprise the actual map image itself, that is the points, the zoom functionality, the interactivity, are quote-unquote standard issue elements of digital cartography. And don't get me wrong here, I absolutely love the maps on this slide. I love any sort of queer map. Please make them. If you're making paper maps, give me copies or tell me how much I need to pay you. I absolutely love them. But what I'm looking for is, and what I'm thinking about is what kind of goes beyond just putting queerness on the map. Well, that was the next sentence. What I realized I've been looking for is a queering of cartography, not a queering of symbology or map projections, but a queering of our daily practices of the way in which we build and create community in cartography. I've been looking for signs that we might be examining more critically how we reproduce this highly diverse practice we call cartography. From a political perspective, in a moment of intense identity politics, trying to pull back to the normative center of cartography may seem counterintuitive or perhaps even conservative. But if queer cartography is to have a presence in the cartographic community moving forward, and be more than just accepting that some cartographers might be queer in their gender expression or sexual orientation, or that we can make maps of queer spaces, we need to articulate what queer cartography can do, why we should foster this thinking, and how we all benefit from queer cartography. And so to that end, the creation of visual depictions of space is inherently a queer practice. And that's why I think it's important to state that cartography has been, is, and will always be a queer practice. And I'll say it again. It has been, is, and always will be a queer practice. I don't think there's any ifs, ands, or buts about that. And so what I'm going to take the next couple minutes to do is kind of explain what I mean by a queer practice, and then show how some elements of cartography that are kind of part and parcel of what it means to make a map, regardless of what cartographic paradigm you're in, what society you're coming from, et cetera, how these elements of mapping are inherently queer. So without diving too deep into the lexiconic history of the phrase of queer practice, I do want to define a couple terms. So the first is the word queer. While some of us in this room might consider the word queer a slur, the term has been reappropriated in recent years to positively describe the difference from the norm in gender and sexuality. In this sense, queer can be both used as an adjective and a verb. That is, something can be described as queer, so difference from the norm, but we can also queer something in the sense that we are purposely questioning and examining commonly accepted practices through a lens of difference. So we're seeking to find the difference in something. On the other hand, practice is a word that we are probably more likely familiar with. It's the actual application of something in a habitual way separate from theory. Additionally, much in the way that doctors and lawyers have their own practices, they call themselves, this is my personal practice. Practice suggests that there's a barrier of entry to some kind, along with a community that shares and fosters these sets of actions. So queer practice then, or as I'm defining it, is one where we are constantly seeking to examine our currently accepted norms to alter how we perform our daily tasks. So as I say here, it's a community of actions. Oh, there's a typo in there, but community of actions where difference is constantly being looked for. So if cartography has been, is, and will always be a queer practice, what exactly does that look like today? And so I'm going to show how this works basically through looking at basically taking one major tenet of queer theory as it applies to cartographic practice. And I also want to say what I'm going to show here is just one example. I think there are many other examples, and maybe we'll get into that on the panel. So we take generalization and symbolization, for instance. These two concepts are at the core of all maps. It's through which we abstract, simplify, and represent the Earth in miniature. As all of us in this room know, there's no correct way to generalize or symbolize phenomena. In each map we create, we have to balance the real world conditions with the abstraction that we're creating. And even when there are agreed upon standards or practices and about how to go about performing these tasks, so we might think of commonly accepted symbols for parking or for bathrooms, or we're generalizing, so you hit this button in ArcGIS Pro. There are always creeping issues that arise as society, technology, and the like change. So there's always kind of this ongoing change. And so the queerness in these concepts comes from the fact that there's no perfect way to do these tasks. So if we take the maps that we see on the screen here, these maps are all kind of queer to our eye in the sense that our culture of cartography is different from these others. But even if these maps were not queer to our eyes, these cartographers of long ago faced similar challenges around generalization and symbology. It's safe to say then that at every stage of the cartographic process, even if there is a standard or ideal version of how particular tasks should be carried out, there are many conceivable and equally valid alternatives to reach the same point, even within the same kind of sort of standards. But really, generalization and symbolization, much like kind of map making in general, is a type of performativity where we as cartographers decide based on many factors what a map should look like. And so the concept of performativity, some of you may be familiar with this, comes from gender and women's studies and argues that gender in all of its facets is essentially a performance that we enact every day. Our clothing choices, our speech patterns, our posture, and many other things that are more subliminal than that, all reflect how we choose to or how we have been conditioned to act in particular ways. So the easiest way to think about this is to consider the classic example of baby boys get dressed in blue and baby girls get dressed in pink. While this seems to be a long-standing tradition, historically the colors were actually reversed. And so while it's simplistic, it highlights how gender is an act that gets performed every day. There are societal things that condition how we understand it. And so it's important to note that performativity is not necessarily something that is bad. It's something that just is. Performativity becomes bad when we assign rigid ideas about how people should act or be and punish and act bias to those who exhibit difference from the standard performativity. And while performativity is often seen through the lens of gender and sexuality, our maps and our mapping community has this kind of performance as well. On the visual level, we accept our maps will do certain things, that they will be legible in certain ways. And so it's okay to have maps in particular styles, but we don't want to be rigid about what we do. And we could also think as well about what we expect, what sort of training we expect cartographers to have, where they go to study, things like that. Those are all kind of part and parcel of what it means to be performative in some of these spaces. So to get back to this definition of queer practice, you might notice that in this definition, there's no discussion of gender or sexuality at all. And this is an intentional and important distinction. A queer practice need not be one that obviously centers gender and sexuality at every turn. And so, of course, in no way am I arguing or saying that queer practice should be severed from its origins in queer and feminist thought. But a queer practice is just that. It's, as we've defined, a practice is separate from theory and aimed at actually implementing things in the real world. For us to make cartographic practice a part of our larger cartographic community, then, it has to come from the bottom up. The honest truth, and perhaps an open secret, is that most academic cartographers make very few maps. I don't know, maybe I committed a sin there. This is not a good idea since I'm on the job market, but whatever. Academic cartographers in some way are as abstracted from the daily practice of cartography as much as a practicing cartographer is abstracted from teaching. That is, of course, there is of course overlap. It's not that academic cartographers never make maps or that practicing cartographers never teach skills, but the point is that there's often a binary between the worlds of academic and practicing cartography, with academic thought sometimes dominating how we conceptualize cartographic practice. And so by thinking in this space, thinking in the space of practice with practicing professionals about how we might queer cartography, we can shape cartography in the years to come. That's why queering cartographic practice remains such an urgent issue, because it shapes not only how we do our work, but how we reproduce this community and who gets or who even wants to call themselves a cartographer. And so if all of this kind of sounds like an old refrain from a critical cartography talk you saw 10 years ago, critical cartography, if you don't know what it is the study of power that maps have to influence our world. You're not far off. Queer cartography is very much an outgrowth of this tradition. But I think it's important to see queer cartography as separate from, and perhaps the successor to, critical cartography. For much of human geography, and I say this as someone who would also call themselves a human geographer, it seems that critical cartography is now a taken-for-granted approach, and that attention has shifted away from cartography to examining digital spaces. In fact, one recent article, I won't say which, referred to critical cartography as a, quote, classic approach, which is a nice way of saying old. And so the movement in what is left of critical cartography, and I would also say this as someone who primarily identifies as a critical cartographer, is towards critical domain-specific applications of GIS and cartography as they intersect with a specific topic. In other words, we understand that cartography reproduces specific forms of social power, and we want to subvert those power relations through doing something different with maps. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. I think it's very important and very powerful. But I'm afraid that it misses the larger issues that are closer to home. It gets back to Mark Daniil's comments about radical cartography. Sure, the map is of a radical topic, but is it really a map based in a radical cartographic tradition? Cartography is a collective project where diverse individuals create community around a shared set of tools and techniques. If all the cartographers disappeared today, not only in this room, but globally, cartographic practice as we know it would cease to exist. It's all of us in this room and all the people who identify as cartographers which help create the horizons of possibility for cartography. In other words, using cartography to make change in the world is a good and noble goal, but we will be limited by how much change we can make if we are slow or refuse to change internally. Say it another way, perhaps more bluntly, we might say that human geographers have moved on from trying to change cartography, and it's now up to us to actually make that change ourselves. And of course, I would say we are definitely not starting from scratch here. Cartographers like Megyn Kelly have shown us the importance of designing feminist icons. Lou's PCD talk, which was not recorded. Also, I was not in attendance at, provides some tangible starting points for inclusive cartographic practice. And Amber Boss's work, melding feminist thought with cartographic practice through their consulting practice, shows how the academic and the theoretical need not be separated. And while some of these individuals might place their work in other traditions of cartographic practice, I would argue that their work helps reimagine what cartography is and can be, providing us with ideas about how to refashion the practice of cartography along queer lines. The search for the future of cartography will not come from trying to better define what is or isn't a map, nor in precisely calibrating colors and symbols, nor from better eye tracking, or for coming up with queer p-values, or implementing queer user studies, but rather from a constant diversifying, that is a constant queering of our practices. And that doesn't mean a queer eye tracking study isn't useful. In fact, I would love to see what that means. I don't know what that means. I think that would be really interesting. But it's rather to say that queer cartographic practice requires a different toolkit than what most of us are equipped with and trained to do. Cartography is not some omniscient being, as some scholars have talked about. We make cartography every time we make a map, every time we think about a map, every time we meet with each other in these spaces. It can be anything we want it to be, but we, that is, all of us in the room, are the gatekeepers of cartography. We are the ones who establish the norms, we are the ones who grade the exams, we are the ones who judge the maps. We are the ones who determine what is and isn't cartography. And so the point is not to find new ways to gatekeep, obviously, or to come up with an ideal definition of what is or isn't a map or what makes a perfect map, but rather to acknowledge the power that we have as a community to reorient cartographic practice writ large. I also want to say that queer cartographic practice is also important beyond the immediate NACIS community. While NACIS has long struggled to embrace the NA in NACIS, that is the North American beyond the United States, there is a much wider cartographic community beyond the borders of North America. For anyone who has attended the International Cartographic Conference, which is a wonderful conference to go to, cartographic traditions around the world are buttressed by local cartographic communities that sometimes hold on to rigid ideas about what it means to be a cartographer. Part of what we have to do, in a global sense, is show how a queering of cartographic practice enables a more relevant and useful form of cartography. And regardless of how one feels about ongoing global conflicts, the rise of authoritarianism and democracies around the globe, the war in Ukraine, the recent explosion of violence in Israel and Palestine, it's clear that there are threats to the ability to embrace otherness and difference. Because of this, it is up to us to embrace that otherness and the aspects of society that are not part of the cartographic community as it currently stands. In much the same way that a queering of cartographic practice does not need to be centered around sexuality and gender, a queering of cartography helps foster room for all sorts of intersectional approaches to cartography that have actual global impacts. Queering of cartographic practice opens the door for a Black cartographic practice and an indigenous cartographic practice, both of which I would argue exist currently, but are really not well represented in cartography at this moment. It opens the door for us to think about the intersection of ability in cartography, as we heard in the earlier session. And queering cartographic practice helps us pave the way for understanding things like the intersection of cartography and labor, or the intersection of cartography with religion or ecology, all of which I would say cartographers and cartographic scholars have somewhat generally ignored. And I would say it asks us to pay attention to and critically make space for these areas of difference. In other words, the action of queering cartography happens over and over again each time someone goes to map. There's no set definition of what queer cartography can or should be. And so there are some significant parallels here to Matthew Edney's recent work examining mapping as a process. And I won't go too much into it. But basically, the idea is that anytime you touch a map, anytime you think about a map, you are engaging in a process that that map has gone through. So it's not just working with the data, but it's, you're looking at a map from 50 years ago. You are now part of the process of that map and that understanding of that map. And so the action of engaging with cartography, in whatever capacity that may be, allows us the possibility to queer each and every time we engage with maps. So where then does that leave us? This is the end, by the way. I could lay out some points for how we could do better as cartographers, but to queer cartography is to constantly question the basic assumptions of what is normative at that moment, rendering any list out of date immediately. Rather, I would say the takeaway from this presentation is the need to queer our practices more often. For example, what would happen if we hosted an impractical cartography day? Where the focus is not to make maps better or faster or more efficient or more effective, but rather to wallow in the practice of cartography and think creatively. What if we shifted our map competitions away from being based around beauty towards being based around the impact of the map in a local community? What if NACIS decided to go to more geographically diverse cities? What if our classrooms and workspaces made room for non-digital methods of cartography more often? None of these are concrete proposals, but rather are illustrations of where we might go as a cartographic community if we queer cartographic practice. By tacking back and forth between practice and theory, we can open new horizons of possibility of where the cartographic community might go and how we can be a more inclusive practice. Queer cartography shows us the way, but it's up to us to follow it. Thank you.